In this video, we are going to create a landing page with a full page navigation menu using Next.js and Framer Motion. And we'll also throw in some loading animations as well. So here's a quick demo of what we're going to build. So when this page loads, if I just refresh the page, you can see the content nicely animates in. And then when I click on the hamburger menu icon in the Navbar, you can see a full page navigation menu nicely animates in. And each of these items also has a nice hover effect as well. To get started, go ahead and download the starter code using the link in the description down below. Make sure to run npm install to get all the dependencies. And with that, let's jump in. Here we have the starter code for the project. It's just a blank one-page website built using Next.js and styled with Tailwind. A couple of things I want to call out before we jump into the code. The first is I've already included all the assets that we need for this project in the public folder, so primarily a couple of SVG files. And for loading those SVG files, I've added a SVG loader already in the next config file, so it's easier for us to work with. And the final thing is I've gone ahead and created a utils folder and an animations file here. So this will be where we will define all of our Framer Motion config files. And for now, I've just thrown in a couple of easings that we'll use in a couple of different places. Let's start by building out the content and structure of the landing page. In the index file, I'm going to go in here and hide this for a second, move the placeholder content in the main tag. And in this main tag, I'm going to surround everything in a section tag. And in this section tag, we're going to have a couple of things. We're going to have a navbar, and then we'll have the actual landing page content. So let's actually start with the landing page content first. But first, actually on this section, I'm going to add some styles to lay all this out. So I'm just going to say height should be screen, background of black. Going to do a position of relative, and have flexbox and flex call. And then now let's move to the landing page content. This is just going to be a div. And in this div, we're going to have an h1 that says we design. We are going to add a div here next for the second row of content. Now the second row, if you might remember, has a horizontal line and then some text. So it's going to have two components. So first it'll have just a div that will be the line. And there will be another h1, which will say some content. After this div, we're going to add another div. And inside this div, we're going to have the final h1 with some content. And then finally, after this h1 div, we're going to have another div. And this div will have a paragraph tag, which will have some content as well, which I'll just quickly copy in. So now when I hit save, we actually can't really see anything right now. And that is because all of the text is also black. So we can't see on the black background. So let's go ahead and start adding some styles so we can start playing around with this. So on this surrounding div, I'm going to add some class names. First, text white. So now we can actually start seeing the content. Then I'm going to apply uppercase class. I'm going to set the tracking to be wider, given we're working with some larger text. I'm going to give it a horizontal padding of 8. Margin X of auto to center it, flex 1, flex call, and then I'm going to set some dynamic text sizes based on the size of the page. So by default, it will be 5XL. I'm also going to add a leading of snug. For small screens and larger, it will be a text of 6XL with a leading of snug. Once we get to medium screens, we want this text to be 7XL with a leading of tight. On large screens, we'll take the text to be 6.2 rem. And on XL, we want the text to be 8 rem. So now when I hit save, we have content here that is working. The reason why it's so big is because we have the paragraph down here that's taking up a lot of space, but we'll change that in a little bit. So on this first H1, we're going to add one class name. So on medium screens and above, we're going to add a padding left of 10%. So you can see that shifts the positioning of this first one. Next, on this div here, which contains the second h1, we're going to give it flex, items center, a BG of black, and a Z value of 10. Now, why this background of black? Well, we're going to see in a second when we start doing animations. Okay, so then for this div here, this is going to be that horizontal line. So let's style it so we can see it. Background of white, height of 1, flex of 1, margin right of 8. By default, it's going to be hidden, but on medium screens and above, this will be display block so we can see it. And then I'm also going to set a origin of left here, which we're setting for animations. So when I hit save, okay, we can see now this line has appeared. Now on this h1 tag, all I'm just going to make sure we do is set a z of 20. And then finally on this div here with the final h1, I will set again background of black, z of 20. This background black is again for the animations for the same reason as up here. Okay, so now finally let's go to this final paragraph and style it. So for this div, we're going to set a BG of black, again for the same reason of animations, a z of 30, flex 1. For the text color, we're going to set it to a new color here. So have this hex code, which I'm going to use with the full padding top of 8. On medium, I'm going to set a padding left of 20%. The text size will be text base. We're going to set this to be normal case, so not uppercase. Tracking is normal, and leading is normal. So we're essentially undoing some of the text formatting we did up above. Okay, so now this is looking like a more normal piece of text. The only thing I'm going to do as well is because this is kind of long for a single line, I'm going to force it to wrap more quickly. So on this paragraph tag, I'm just going to give it a max width of large, and now it will wrap more. Okay, so that is the core text content of the landing page. Now let's go ahead and build out the navbar as well. So for the navbar, I'm going to go ahead and put it into a new component. So I'm going to go here and make a new folder called components. And inside here, a new file called navbar.tsx. Make a quick placeholder component, and then I'm just going to pull it in here, navbar. And now we'll just go back to the navbar. For now, I'm first going to start with the content, and then we'll deal with the props. Here, instead of returning a just empty div, I'm going to return a couple of things. So first is I want to add the logo. And for that, I'm just going to go up here and say import logo from, and I'm just going to find it here in the public folder, logo.svg. And because of the SVG loader that's added on the next config file, we can just pull this in like a normal component. So much so that I can also add a class name. And here I'm going to say width of 200 pixels and a height of 30 pixels. And let me self-close this. The middle is going to be a hamburger icon menu, which we'll get to in a second. We'll call this the toggle button. And then on the right side of this, we're going to add a link. Now, this link is not going to go anywhere for now, but we'll just put it in here. It's going to say get in touch. And I'm going to import from next link. And we need to add a href. And we can't see anything, so let's go ahead and do some styling on all these elements. So for the overall div, I'm going to say a display of grid. Grid calls 3, so 3 columns. Item center for centering all the items. Padding of 8. Gonna make it sticky so it stays at the top. Top of 0. Mix blend difference and Z of 100. Now, why do we have this mix blend difference? Well, it's because this is going to come into play when we add the full page nav menu and it comes down. So this nav bar is still going to stay on screen, but what we're going to notice is because the nav menu is going to have a bright, almost white background, when it comes over all this content in the nav bar, instead of it being washed out, it's actually going to change the color, the way we're viewing the color, so that it becomes a dark color automatically because of this mix blend difference. We'll see that in action in a little bit. Then on this link tag, let's go ahead and add a couple of styles so we can actually see it. So justify self n. We give this a brighter text color, and let me retype that in. Text large, give it a font of light, tracking wide, underline, and the underline offset we'll set to 8. So now we have this. Now, it's not positioned correctly because we currently don't have the toggle button inserted yet, and that will actually be what's in the middle grid column. So let's go ahead and add this toggle button. But for this toggle button, I'm going to go ahead and actually create it in a separate component file. And it's because we're going to do some animations on it later, so it'll be easier to encapsulate this in a separate file. So let's go ahead and create a new file. And we're going to call this the nav menu toggle.tsx. Create a component, and I'm just going to go ahead and pull this in now. So nav menu toggle. And so now when I hit save, actually you can see this link now gets pushed correctly. Let's actually go ahead and add this. I'm going to first pull in a couple of values that will be helpful. So let me go ahead and just copy those in right now. Okay, so these are a couple definitions for SVG files. And you can see here call them variants. So there's going to be two SVGs that we're kind of using here, because if we remember, the hamburger icon is two horizontal lines, and then when you want it to become a close icon, it becomes a cross. So those we're going to treat as two separate SVGs, and there'll be an open and a closed state. So the open state would be when the nav menu is open, which means we want it to be a closed icon. And so this is what defines essentially the two diagonal lines. And the closed state is what defines the two horizontal lines for the hamburger icon. So now let's go ahead down here into the div. And instead of returning this text, I'm going to return this div. And we're going to have a SVG tag here. And in this SVG tag, we're going to have a path. And for this path, I'm just going to go ahead and pass in, for now, path1 variance dot closed. And then I'm going to copy and paste this and put in the path2 variance dot closed. And then let's add some quick styles here. So on the SVG, I'm going to add a width of 24, height of 24, and a view box of 0, 0, 24, 24. And then on this div surrounding it, we're going to add a justify self center. So remember now, this is what's going into the grid. So centering it in its column. I'm going to do a flex call, gap of 2, cursor pointer, a stroke of white, so we can actually see these SVGs, and a stroke width of 2. Now when I hit save, there we go. We see the icon, and this is the closed state of the icon here, which is the two horizontal lines. So now that we have all of the content laid out here, let's start setting up some of the animations for this landing page. Let's actually start with the content here, the text content, and start animating it in on page load. For that, let's start by first going to the parent of all of this content in this index file. We can convert this to be a motion div. And let's import motion from Framer Motion. And all I want to do here is set the names of initial and animate that we're going to be using in our config objects. So now what we're going to do is we're going to convert, let's first convert everything we need to be a motion component first. So we're going to set this h1 to be a motion component. We are going to set the motion components for this h1 as well, and for this h1 down here as well. This div is going to become a motion div for the line. It's going to animate in. And we're also going to set this p tag as well to be a motion component. So this by itself won't do anything, but now we can now pass in the config files for the animations. So the first couple I'm going to do are going to be for the horizontal line. So here I'm going to add the configurations. So initially, the starting point for the loading animation, we want this scale X to be 0. And then the end state of the loading animation, we need the scale X to be 1. And for transition, we're going to set the duration to be 0.8. And for the ease, we're going to use this easings helper list that we have in the animation file and use ease and out quint. Now when I hit save, if I refresh the page, there we go. The line nicely animates in left to right. Now let's go ahead and also animate this p tag in at the bottom. So for this, we're going to set a initial to be opacity of 0. And for the animation, we're going to bring the opacity to 1. So we're essentially going to fade this in. And for the transition, we're going to set the delay to be 0.8, the duration to be 0.8. And for ease here, we're going to use easings.easeOutQuart. All right, so now if I refresh the page, this loads in with some delay, but nicely fades in. Okay, so why did I leave the remaining h1 tags alone for the animation? Well, that's because we're going to use pretty much the same animation across all of them with some different delays. So let's just go ahead and define it once in the animations file, and then we can bring it in. So let's go to the animations utility file I created already for us. And we're going to set a transition object up, and we're going to export it. And we're going to call this text reveal motion. And for this one, we're actually going to pass in a delay ourselves. And now we're going to return the animation config object. So here we want the initial to be Y of 100. So start 100 pixels push down, and also the opacity to be 0. And then on animation, we'll say we want Y to become 0, opacity to become 1. And the transition, we want to use the delay that we passed in. the duration to be 0.8, and the ease to be easings.easeOut_court. So that is the animation that we want to pull in. So now if we go back to the index file, we can pass this in now. So for this first H1, we are going to pass in variance. And here we're going to pull in the text reveal motion, and we're going to set a 0 delay on it. I'm going to copy this code here and paste it for this next H1 down here. Here, I'll just set a delay to 0.2 instead of 0. And then on this final H1, I'll again pass this in, but set a delay of 0.4. So now if I hit save and then refresh the page, there we go. And you can see there's a really subtle effect here where the text seems like it's coming from behind a wall almost. And that's why this background black we added here. So we get that effect. So we've now set up the animations for the landing page. Let's do one final animation here, which will be for this hamburger icon to animate to the X that we want. Now for this, let's go back to the nav menu toggle component. And we know what we need to do here is we need to ultimately have a property here that controls whether the menu icon should be in the open or the closed state. For now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this up as a prop that gets passed in, and we'll go ahead and set up the appropriate way to pass this in after this. But let's call this the nav menu toggle props. And it will take a menu open, which will be a Boolean that will tell us if the nav menu in this case is open or not. And I'm also going to go ahead and set up passing in the setter for this value as well. And this will just be a function that takes a Boolean and returns void. And so now this nav menu toggle, we know we can set it up as a functional component, which will take the props that we just defined. And I'll also destructure these props as well. So menu open and set menu open. Now to actually set this up, we need to do a couple of things. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go down here and I'm going to create animation control objects. So I'll call the first one path1 controls, which I'll say is use animation, which comes from Framer Motion. And I'll also create one for the path2 as well. So this corresponds to the two paths that we have here because we need different animation controls for each. And then in a use effect, I'm going to set up these animation controls as well. This will say if the menu is open, then I want path1 controls, and I want to start the animation to path1 variance open. And similarly, we want to do this for path2 as well. So path2 controls using path2 variance.open. Else, we want to run these controls, but to the closed variance instead. So closed and closed. And the dependency here, of course, will be menu open. So every time that menu open changes, it's going to run this use effect, and it's going to start the appropriate animations based on what the value of menu open is now. A couple other steps we can add here. So on this div now, what we can do is we can add a onClick. And this onClick will simply say, if we click this, then we should set the menu open to be the opposite of what our menu open is today, because this is what's going to control the value ultimately of menu open. In these path tags, we need to convert these to be motion components. And I'll import motion. And then inside here, we need to pass the animate property, and we'll pass the controls. So in this case, path1 controls, and also we'll set a transition of duration 0.2. And I'm just going to copy and paste this for the second path as well, but change this to path2 controls. Now I hit save, and we've actually gone ahead and set everything up here. But now what we need to do is we need to pass in the correct props into this component so that this all is hooked up and is working. So for that, we ultimately want these properties to actually come from the index file, but we need to pass them through this navbar first. So in the navbar, we're going to set up props here, and we will go back here and just essentially copy actually these same props that just need to get passed through the navbar. And then I will set the navbar here to be a functional component of type navbar props. We can destructure these two properties, and then we can simply pass these through to the toggle. So menu open will be menu open, and set menu open will be set menu open. And then finally, in this index file, we need to actually pass in these into the navbar now to get this all connected. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to set up a state variable at the top, menu open, set menu open. And this will be a use state and originally be of value false. And then I will simply just pass these in to the navbar, which will pass it to the toggle component. All right, so now everything seems to be working. So we should be able to see if I click this button, there we go. It nicely animates, and then click it again, it animates back. So now we have the animation of the hamburger icon. So now that we have all this connected, let's actually create the full page navigation menu. So let's start by creating a new component for this. So in this components folder, I can create one called nav menu.tsx. We'll do a placeholder component for now. And what I'm just going to go ahead and quickly do is add some basic styling to the container so that we can start seeing it. So in the nav menu, instead of this div, we're going to have it return a nav. And I'm just going to add some simple class names to this. And we're going to give a position absolute, height screen, width screen, background, and I'm going to give it this hex code background. And I also set up a couple of other things here as well. Just give it the flex call, justify, and padding of 8 and a z of 50. And then now let's go ahead and actually pull this nav menu in. So let's go to the index file. And in here, I'm going to simply go above this nav bar and say, if menu open is true, then let's go ahead and show the nav menu. Hit save, and let's go ahead and try this out. So if I click this button, there we go. We have the nav menu that we created so far, the container. And one thing that you'll notice, as I mentioned earlier, is because of the mixed blend mode we set on the nav bar, all of the content actually has changed colors in a sense automatically, so it's visible even on the nav menu. Now, the one thing that is not super great is the way that this nav menu comes in. It sort of just pops up out of nowhere and it's not nicely animated in. So let's go ahead and change that. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the nav menu component and I'm going to convert this div to be a motion component. So we'll call it a motion nav. We'll pull in Framer Motion and we'll change this as well. And then I'm going to add the appropriate properties here to define the animation. So what we want is initially, we want the Y to be minus 100%, so completely off screen. And we want it to animate to when Y is 0. And for this transition, I'm going to set a duration of 1, and ease will be easings.easeOutCourt. And I'm also going to set up a exit property as well here for when it leaves. And the exit property will be Y will be, again, minus 100%. And the transition will be a little bit quicker with duration of 0.3. So now let's go ahead and try this. So I'm going to open the navbar. It nicely comes in. And when I click it, well, the animation doesn't seem to work for the exit. And that's because we need to surround this component in animate presence in this index file. So let's go ahead and quickly do that. So animate presence. And then let's go ahead and move this closing tag as well to the end here. And now if we try this again, open it, it nicely animates in. And when I close, it nicely animates out. All right, so now let's go ahead and actually set up the components in the navbar itself. So all the menu items here. So for that, let's go into the navbar menu. And inside of this nav, we are going to need to enumerate essentially the list of the navbar items. So first thing I'm actually going to do is I'm going to copy in an array of strings that will correspond to the navbar items. So this will be our list of items. And then what we want to do is we're going to want to map over these. So inside of this nav, we're going to do a unordered list. And inside this unordered list, we're going to map over the nav items. So nav items.map item and index. I'm going to use that for a key. And then we're going to pass it into something called the nav menu item component, which we haven't set up yet. And it's going to take a couple of values that, again, we haven't set up yet, but it's going to take a key. It's going to take an index, which is going to be idx plus 1. And we'll see why we add 1 in a second. And the title will be item. I'll also throw an error because this component doesn't exist. So let's go ahead and create that. So I'm going to go into the components folder, create a new file, call it nav menu item.tsx, create a placeholder component, and let's create the interface here so we can pass the props in. So this is the nav menu item props index which would be a type number, and title of type string. And we then know that we can set this up to be a React functional component, which takes these props in, and we can destructure them as well. So now if I hit save here and I hit save here once I import this, there shouldn't be any errors, but it does show the nav menu items now at the bottom here. And it's at the bottom because we set the justify end property here on the surrounding flexbox div. The one other quick thing I'm just going to do before we go into this as well is I'm going to add a quick subtle animation to the unordered list. So I'll make this a motion UL. And here I'm just going to set a exit property. And this will just be to nicely animate this whole thing out when the nav menu closes. And I'm just going to set the exit to be opacity 0, transition, duration of 0. So it's just going to immediately hide this actually when this whole thing closes. And we'll notice that when I hit the X, it's difficult to see, but it nicely hides immediately the items of the unordered list. All right, so let's go into the nav menu item and let's build this out. Instead of a div here, I'm going to make this a list item since it's inside an unordered list tag. And inside of this list item, I'm going to have a div. And inside this div, we are going to need to have a couple of things. We are going to have a divider line first. And so for that, that's just going to be a self-closing div. We're going to have a span. And this span is going to correspond to the number of the items. So say like 1, 2, 3. And this is why we actually had index plus 1 being passed in, because by default, the index is 0 index, but we actually want to list out 1, 2, 3, etc. So that's why we passed in plus 1. For that, I will pass in the index, but instead of just passing in the index itself, I'm going to pass in index dot to locale string, and it'll be of type English US. And this is going to be the important one. I'm going to pass in something called minimum integer digits, and I'm going to pass in a value of 2. Now, why is that? Let me actually go and open this up. What it's going to do is that's going to give the ability to format and give back this nice almost stylized version of the numbers. So instead of just being 1, it will be 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, 3. So that's what this is giving us. And then underneath this span, we're going to have an H1 where we'll just put the title. And we finally will need to add a SVG of the arrow here on each of the items as well. So let's go ahead to the top, and I'm going to import arrow from, and I'm going to pull it from the public folder arrow.svg. And then we can simply come down here and throw this first into a div. And inside that div, I'll put the arrow component. And for now, I will pass the class name in here so that we can actually see it. So height of 6, width of 6. And finally, I will add a div down here that will be our divider. So this div actually is not going to be a divider. We'll get to see what that is in a second, but this div is a divider down here. So now let's actually go ahead and style all of these different things, because right now it doesn't look very great. So let's first go to the surrounding li tag, and let's add class name. Go ahead and give it a cursor pointer, padding y of 8, position relative, and a width of full. So that will space this out nicely a little bit. Now let's go to some of these subcomponents. So for the div here, I'm going to give it a display flex, items center, position relative, and a width of full. For this div here, I will give it class names, and we'll see what this is in a second. Position absolute, inset of 0. So left, right, bottom, and top all set to 0. And we'll give it a background of this hex code. Now everything will disappear. So what this div is essentially fully covering the entire content of each of these LIs. Now, the reason we're doing this is, again, for the loading animation. What we're going to do is when we load this div is going to shrink to a height of 0, which will reveal, in a sense, all the content in the LI. Now, obviously, we can't see this. So for now, I'm just going to set this to be display none or hidden so we can see our content. Then let's go into the span next. So for the span, I'm going to set a width of 4 characters, text of 2XL. On small screens, a text of 3XL, and on medium screens, a text of 4XL. Then for this H1, I'm going to add some styles. So we're going to make these uppercase, tracking of wide, text 4XL. On small screens, a text of 5XL, and on medium screens, a text of 6XL, and flex 1. So this actually makes it nice and big. And this flex 1 also pushes this remaining content, the arrow, all the way to the right for us. And then finally, let's go ahead and style this divider here, which is this final div. So this is going to be a position absolute, bottom of 0, height of 2 pixels, BG of black, width of full, and origin left, which is going to be for the loading animation scaling. And one thing we'll notice is that this line is way too close to the rest of the content, and that is because I need to move this out one place in the tree so it gets the correct use of the gap here in the LI, specifically for this padding. Now that gives us the spacing that we need. All right, so this is the core content. So now let's set up some of these animations that we've been talking about. So let's actually start with some of the simpler ones. So let's start with this divider. I'm going to define this in the animations file, as we've been doing for other animations. And I'm going to go ahead and export this and call it the divider motion. And here we're going to set initial to be scale x of 0. And for animate, we're going to say scale x should be 1. And for the transition, delay should be 1, duration should be 0.8, and the ease should be easings.ease and out quint. And now let's go ahead and attach this to the divider. So here, let's convert this div to be a motion div, and we will simply pass it in. Variance should be the divider motion that we just defined. And let me just import Framer Motion as well. Okay, so now this loads in, and now when I open this, and it doesn't seem to actually work when I open this. Now, why is that? Well, it's actually because I need to tell Framer Motion how to use this initial and animate properties. And I haven't done that yet. So let me go to the motion LI and just define this for all of the children here of this list item component. So convert this into a motion component. And then here, I'm just going to tell it that for the initial, use the initial property. For animate, use the animate property. I'm also going to go ahead and set up the while hover as well, because we'll use that in a second. So for this, we're going to tell it to use the hover property. And now, if I reload the page, we actually notice it worked here. But if I open this, there we go. Dividers nicely animate in as expected. Next up, let's go ahead and set up the arrow. And for the arrow, what we want to do is when we hover over the arrow, we want it to rotate to introduce some interactivity. So for this, let's go back to the animations file, and we're going to create the object here. So we're going to call it arrow motion. And here we're going to say on hover, which we called the hover property, set rotate to be -90. And then for transition, we're going to set the type to be a spring, the bounce to be 0.5, and duration to be 0.5. Add a comma here. And then simply on this arrow, on the div itself, we're going to make this a motion component. And this is because for the SVG imports, we can't convert them to be motion components. So that's why we're going to surround it in a div and apply the variance on this div. So variance will be arrow motion. Hit save, and let's just go ahead and reload this. And now if I hover, there we go. You can see it nicely rotates back and forth. And we can see there's a little bounce at the end, which is the spring animation type coming into play. Next, let's also add a hover effect for the span here as well. So for that, let's go back to the animation file, and we're going to go ahead and define this down here. And we're going to call this one item content motion. And for this, we're going to say on hover, we want the width to become 5 characters, transition to be type spring, bounce to be 0.5, and the duration to be 0.5. So largely in sync with the arrow hover animation. Now, this might seem a bit odd, but we'll see in a second what this ends up doing. So on this span, I'm going to attach this. So make this a motion span. And what you'll notice is that in the original styling, we set the width of this to be 4 characters. And what we're saying is when we hover, we want the width to become 5 characters. And so what this is going to do is going to make it a little bit wider, which is going to push the rest of this content to the right. So that's the effect that we're ultimately going for. So here I'm just going to say variance, and this will be item content motion. Now when I hit save, refresh the page, there we go. We get this nice little movement of the rest of the content, and look how it's also bouncing there at the end. And that's that spring animation coming into play. So the final animation that we're going to add here is for the cover here that we created earlier at the very top. So remember, by default, this is hidden. So let's remove this hidden. And remember, this is fully covering the content. So we need this to essentially disappear for us when we load the page. So for that, we're going to define a final animation object here. We'll call this item cover motion. And here we're going to say initially height should be 100%. So the normal height. But on animate, we want the height to go to 0. And for the transition, we want a delay of 1, duration of 0.8. And for ease, do easings.ease and out quint. Now, if we go back to the nav menu item, we need to convert this div to a motion div and then pass the variance in here. So variance will be the item cover motion. Now let's go ahead and refresh this whole page. We want to open the nav menu. We have that nice reveal that's in sync with also the line loading in, which is really nice. When I close it, everything just closes. Now, there is one weird corner case that I want to touch on here, which will happen if I quickly go this and I hover. You'll see this, look at this weird state that happens. When I hover while the animation is happening, the loading animation, you get this like really weird, janky state of all these elements. And this is because while this loading animation is happening, the hover is getting triggered, which then triggers other animations which are conflicting. And that's why you get these like really weird states where the other animations pause while this hover animation is active because you're hovering. But we just do want to prevent this. And to do this, we're going to effectively disable pointer events while these animations are loading so that we don't have this weird stuff happening. To do that, in the nav menu item, we're going to create first a state variable at the top here. And we're going to call this is loading. And this will be what we use to figure out and track essentially if we want the hover state to become available or not. So by default, use state is going to be true. So set this originally to true, and let's import use state. And then what we're going to do is for this motion li tag, we're going to change this class name to be a dynamic string literal because we're going to inject some values here. And what I'm going to check for is if is loading is true, then we're going to say that pointer events should be none. So don't enable hovers to get triggered and such. Else pointer events auto. So just do the normal pointer events. By default, this looks fine. So now if I actually reload this and try to do that same hover thing again, you'll notice it doesn't do anything anymore. It doesn't get weird anymore because by default is loading is set to true and therefore pointer events is set to none. So the hover events don't get triggered. But you also notice right now I can't hover. There's no hover effects at all, even after it loads. So we need to update this is loading at the right time. And how do we do this is, well, we're going to use this handy callback from Framer Motion on this li, which is going to say on animation complete. So when all the animation is complete in this li, then we're going to say set is loading to be false. And so now when I refresh the page, open this, nothing weird happens, but now the animations are done. I can hover and look, all the hover effects are working as expected now. With that, we finished creating this full page navigation menu. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments below. And on screen now is another video for you to check out, and I'll see you in the next video.